Most of you know Bill McKibben as a founder of 350.org, the author of numerous important works on the Earth and climate change, and as a distinguished professor of environmental studies at Middlebury College. But tonight you will meet Bill McKibben, the novelist, whose latest book, Radio Free Vermont, is a buy and cheer local tale of secession, shootouts, and Green Mountain Ale that actually name-checks the venerable Orson Bean. For that reason alone, it's a cause for celebration. Here to tell you more, please welcome Bill McKibben.
Thank you very much. And look what's up here on the, I don't even know how to say it, Neshaminy Creek Brewing Company. Oh, this is excellent. I feel almost guilty. The last couple of nights I've actually read in Vermont, and several of the local breweries have showed up with beer for everyone. I don't feel like I can really drink in front of you, you know. It's this is, I will say, right at the beginning, there is a certain amount of, it's a fairly beer-soaked book, it must be said. That's Vermont's single biggest, it's now second only to tourism, second only to skiing as tourism in Vermont, a beer tourism. More breweries per capita than any place on the planet. As if Bernie wasn't enough to kind of entice you north. It's a real pleasure to be here. It was a real pleasure to get to meet beforehand with all the folks from 350 Philadelphia and 350 Bucks County. They're doing yeoman service, among other things, in trying to talk Philadelphia out of the idea that it wants to be the fossil fuel hub for the future. This is let me just say, a bad idea on so many levels, quite aside from the environmental one. In purely economic terms, given the rapid shift of the planet toward renewable energy, this is the equivalent of dashing down the pier trying to jump on the Titanic as it's sailing out of the harbor, you know. So I think they're going to pass around a clipboard just if there's anybody who wants to get engaged in this fight around climate stuff and energy stuff here in the local area. They're no better set of people to do it with. But I'm not for a moment going to talk about that. We can talk more about it if you want when we do some questions, but I will read you a little bit from this book. It is the first time that I have written fiction on purpose, and I actually wrote it in pieces over the last 8 or 9 years because I spent most of that time on the road all over the world trying to kind of build up this climate movement. And I was homesick as hell all the time for my home in the Green Mountains. So this was a way to inhabit that place in my head, at least, in a succession of hotel rooms and people's spare bedrooms and things across the planet. And I had no idea as I was writing it if I was ever going to publish it or not, but it seemed when Mr. Trump got elected that this was the year to do it. In part because it's a kind of mash note to the resistance that I've been a part of for some years, and it has blossomed so beautifully this past year, maybe the only really good thing about this past year. And also it seemed like it was the right time to publish it because I just couldn't bring myself to inflict my usual depressing fare on everybody this year. It's bad enough. It's as if the president has somehow pumped the water supply full of some kind of reverse Prozac, and everybody is sad and anxious and jittery at all times. And so it seemed the year for something funny, and or at least in that direction. It's gotten, everybody's been very kind, all the reviewers, and they've all noted that it's funny. It's possible that it's not that funny, and that it's mostly the sort of contrast with what I usually write. It may be that it's sort of the equivalent of a dog walking on its hind legs. No one really critiques exactly how well it walks on its hind legs. The mere fact that it's doing it is remarkable enough. It concerns, but it is a story of resistance, and it concerns, it concerns a band of rebels of a sort in the small state of Vermont, who almost by accident end up working for the secession of that state from the Union. Now, secession in this case is more a plot device than an actual plan, although ask me during the second Trump administration what I think about that possibility. But they're motivated above all by a kind of sense of trying to defend the smallness and the uniqueness and the scale of that place, which, like many places, like all our great cities, have a kind of life of their own that tends now to get more and more bleached out in the, let me read you a little bit. A beer truck lumbered slowly off the Crown Point Bridge from New York and began the drive up Route 22 toward Burlington. It hadn't gone a mile before the driver came to an orange detour sign in the middle of the road and turned left on a dirt farm track. He drove about a mile more, past cows staring impassively at the sides of his truck, with its pictures of two young women in bikinis reclining in a hot tub and hoovering Coors Light long necks with an ardor that suggested deep and full-bodied pleasure. Around a bend in the road, the truck driver found another detour sign and followed it for 2 miles till yet another sign guided him down a dirt road next to a creek lined with willows, a creek still flowing in this mild January. And after about a mile of that, with the road turning into a rut, he came upon a lady in a balaclava holding a stop sign. The driver braked, and as he did, 2 young men, also in balaclavas, appeared, one on either side of the truck. Each had a tire pressure gauge, and within seconds, air was hissing out of the front tires and the truck slumped slightly forward. Apologies, said the lady in the balaclava. This will take a little while, I'm afraid. If you wanted to walk to the nearest house and call the police, that's fine, but it's about 4 miles. Or you could wait a little while, and then we'll fill your tires again. Anyway, we've made you a picnic. She put a paper sack on the seat beside him and started lifting things out. BLT with bacon from Vermont Smoke and Cure. Here's a whole pint of Stratford Creamery Maple Walnut ice cream. And here's something special, a bottle of the new Long Trail Coffee Stout from Bridgewater Corners. You can only have one because we're serious about DUI in this state, but I think you'll find it filling. And we've got a gift pack of beers from 51 of Vermont's brewers to send home with you. Did you know we had more breweries per capita than any place on earth? I have no idea why they think we need Coors too. While she talked, the 2 young men were busy hauling down cartons of the Coors. They opened each, quickly untwisted the caps, and then turned the whole box upside down to drain. When the bottles were empty, they loaded the cartons into the back of 2 pickups. The driver watched for a while and eventually spoke. "Hey, lady," he said, "this is going to take forever. I've got 1,200 cartons of Coors in the truck. Why don't you just toss them over the side and let me go?" The woman looked up at him from above a draining carton of beer. "Oh, sweetie," she said, "this is Vermont. We recycle." So these guys who were led by a septuagenarian former radio host end up sort of fugitives holed up in a little farmhouse, and they don't actually, there really is no shootout, at least with real guns. There's no, I'm such a committed, all the guns and things turn out to be unloaded in the course of the book. There's nobody actually got hurt in the making of the thing. But they are fugitives from the law, and so Vern, this older fellow, he's just out wandering around one day, and I'll just read you a little bit about the woods in Vermont because it's sort of, well, because I'm homesick maybe. Vern kept wandering. He'd spent enough time in the world's great landscapes to know this wasn't one of them. There weren't but a few acres of old-growth trees left in Vermont, and even they weren't especially grand. A few giant white pines, but nothing like a redwood. There were no seas of jagged granite peaks, no Class 5 whitewater cataracts. When the Audubon Society made calendars each year, 11 of the 12 pictures came from out west, with alpenglow and buck elk and wildflower meadows. Vermont supplied the picture for October most years, and it was usually a close-up of a yellow maple leaf spinning in an eddy on some tiny stream. Still, he thought as he meandered, he wouldn't trade. Not Vermont for Montana, not big sky for the filtered glimpses of blue and white through the treetops, not hardwood for high granite. For one thing, when that yellow came to Vermont and the red and the orange with it, the colors kept you nearly giddy. And when it was over, it was even better. The leaves were down by mid-October, and you could see the shape of the land again, see the late sun silhouetting the trees along the ridge tops as it set. You could sense the architecture of the hills, every hollow and creek run and knoll visible from the road. When people thought of trees, they thought of leaves. That's how a child would draw them. But the natural inclination of trees at this latitude was bareness. 7 months of the year, at least upslope, they stood there stoic. Leaves were the fevered dream exception to the barren rule, and Vern felt calmer once they were down. He hiked on, watching for the open seeps in what should have been an icy wood. Out west, when you walked, you looked up. The mountains were mostly open. You could see for miles, hundreds of miles. But Vermont was closed in now that the sheep were gone, more than 4/5 forest. You couldn't normally see 100 feet in any direction, and so you tended to look down, and so the glories were minor key. The splay of turkey-tail fungus on a down stump, the root of a birch arched high across a rock, a healthy pile of moose droppings just smaller than ping-pong balls. Vern contemplated that last for a moment. You didn't see moose very often. You didn't see much wildlife because the woods were dense and it was easy for anything shy to disappear. He'd seen more deer in an afternoon at his sister's house in suburban Connecticut than in a season of sitting in his deer stand, rifle on his knees. He remembered a trip to Yellowstone when the kids were young, and how odd it seemed to be able to stand on a ridge and watch bears and elk and bison wandering by below in full view. He felt a little embarrassed for them. It seemed much more natural just to come across traces, scat or a buck rub on the soft bark of a cedar or the claw marks of a bear after beech nuts. He didn't need to see the animal itself any more than he needed to see his neighbors in their houses when he drove down the road. The thin line of smoke coming up from the chimney was assurance enough. But knowing that moose had returned to Vermont in his lifetime pleased him enormously. It was the idea that things repaired themselves, that if you backed off a little and didn't ask too much of the world, then it would meet you halfway. This was one of the few corners of the planet that had gotten better in the last century, he thought. Greener, healthier. The damage that too many sheep had done was wearing off. Or maybe you didn't even need to think of it as damage. It had been good then, when Vermont was full of farmers, and it was good now, when Vermont was full of trees. Life ebbed and flowed, came, went. Goodness didn't demand the one-way arrow toward progress and more. It was, he thought, a blessing to have lived out his life in a place that spun slowly like that yellow leaf in eddy in the American Rapids, a place that was shrinking when most of the country was growing, ever growing. But the too warm January breeze pulled Vern out of his contentment. He saw a sloppy pile of bear scat on the ground next to his foot, and he shook his head. Bears were not supposed to be out in the woods in January, not in Vermont. They should be in their dens. Vermont might be a place outside the world's rush, but the world's rush was doing it in. Winter was vanishing, among other things. You couldn't just ignore the world. That was the problem, because now it pressed in on you without regard for borders. Most presidents in his lifetime you could forget for weeks at a time, but not this one with the endless twittering. Too much somewhere else became too much here. And so they pursue this rebellion. And like all, we were sitting back before talking about organizing and plans people had and everything that people were working on. In my experience now, after 10 or 12 years of building this climate movement, the way you can tell when organizing is going well is when there are things happening that you're no longer responsible for. When things are sort of going on, when the zeitgeist is beginning to shift and things are just starting to happen. So I'll read just a little bit about a few nights later when these guys really know that they're on to something with this rebellion. That night, some Wikipedia-wielding historian noticed that it was the 247th anniversary of the day in 1777 when Vermont declared its independence from Britain. Since that historian also happened to be the Dorset volunteer fire chief, not to mention well into his second four-pack of Fiddlehead's bracing Second Fiddle IPA, he sounded the siren on top of the firehouse in celebration for several minutes, which would have annoyed all the men who answered the call if he hadn't had several four-packs in reserve. They had cell phones. Before the deadline for the 11 p.m. news, half the towns on the western side of the state had sounded their alarms. Coverage on the late newscast from WVTV was enough to convince the Norwich, Vershire, and St. Johnsbury departments that they were missing out on the fun. The next morning, 5 postmasters in Caledonia County arrived at work to find the American flag neatly folded in a regulation triangle on the front steps and a Vermont banner flying from the pole. 4 replaced the flag. The 5th called the local newspaper to take a shot, and by noon the picture was spread across the top of the New York Times website to illustrate a feature story titled, "In Quaint Green Mountain Hamlets, a Push for Independence." By early evening, 2 young men with a piece of rope set up a free Vermont border check on the Addison side of the newly rebuilt Crown Point Bridge. As incoming cars with New York plates slowed to a halt, they handed each driver an apple and a flyer advising of national customs and cultural sensitivities. Vermonters do not like having their pictures taken, but if you offer them a beer, they will usually allow it. Skimpy clothing is encouraged in Vermont. Acting like a New Yorker is discouraged in Vermont. Before the day was out, Ben & Jerry's had announced a new flavor made with Vermont milk and maple syrup. The lid showed Ben & Jerry holding the new Vermont flag, along with a newly discovered quote from General Ethan Allen. "Ever since I arrived to a state of manhood, I have felt a sincere passion for liberty and ice cream with a high butterfat content." Vermont Public Radio put out a press release acknowledging that its switchboard had been overwhelmed with calls from listeners who thought it was un-Vermont-like to continue describing itself as a member station of National Public Radio. "We will take no position on this controversy," the station said, adding, "but we encourage all sides in this dispute to pledge their support in our winter fund drive, which begins tomorrow." One of the reasons I wanted to write this a little bit was because Vermont is an interesting place. And, demographically, it's the most rural state in the Union, and it's white as typing paper, So it should actually be a kind of Trumpish place. And indeed, New Hampshire just to the east and upstate New York just to the west more or less are. But in the middle, Vermont's different. Part of that's probably due to some residue of its history. It was an independent republic for 15 years before it joined the other 13 states. I think a lot of it's probably due to its particular history with town meeting. It's one of the last sort of bastions of real sort of Athenian democracy on the planet. In each town, on the first Tuesday in March, everybody gets together in the church basement or the school gym or something, sits on seats much less comfortable than those, and for however long it takes, does the business of the town, figures out, does the school roof have another year in it? How much should be in the plowing budget for next year, so on and so forth. That's a good way to run a small town, but more to the point, I think it sort of enforces a kind of neighborliness. I try to imagine sometimes what would happen if someone like our president appeared at town meeting in my town talking the way that he routinely talks on Twitter and things, and people would have none of it, they'd look at him for a few minutes and then they'd tell him sit down and let someone else talk, and that would be that. You couldn't get away. I sometimes think that as a country has grown to 300 and some million people, we've started electing people to be president or whatever, as much for kind of shock value or entertainment value or whatever as anything else. But no one would do that if the question at hand was, will my street get plowed or not? You wouldn't let, someone who clearly wasn't thinking responsibly play a big role. So these guys, as they plot their rebellion, they're getting close to town meeting day, and there's going to be on the ballot in most of Vermont's towns this question. And so they decide that they have to surface at least enough to do they've been doing a lot of podcasting and things, but one last sort of radio show with the people of Vermont and let people call in, that they need that kind of contact. And it's hard because the police are closing in, and this makes it much easier for them to find them and things, but they want to do it. And I'll just read you the last call before the thing shuts down, because it makes a point that I want to make before I stop. And the last caller calls in and says, this is Art from Essex Junction. I just want to say I think this whole secession thing is so stupid. The U.S. is the greatest country on earth. If we were off by ourselves, we'd be crushed. We'd be Haiti with Holsteins. That's it, just stupid. Art, said Vern, thanks for the call, and it's the right note to end on. Because I think you're wrong. I think we'd be more like Finland with fall colors. I think we've got plenty of resources to do just fine on our own. But you may be right, and that's the point. I've sat behind a microphone and listened for decades as Americans learn to stop talking with each other and start shouting instead. No discussions, just socialist or fascist or feminazi or bigot or whatever. So here's what I want to say, and I think it's the one thing no one ever says anymore in our public life. I think you're wrong, but you may be right. I actually really believe that part. I think for me the most discouraging thing about the last year has been that it's kind of seems like it might be the final demise of a certain kind of civility in our public life. That we're acquiring, by osmosis, bad habits about how to deal with each other and think. I obviously have firm convictions about the world and the arrest record to prove that I mean them, But I try hard not to be kind of rancorous or bitter or mean-spirited or whatever in them. And I think that's important. The publisher called this a fable, which was fine with me because, as I said in the author's note at the end, an advantage to writing a fable is that you get to append a moral. In this case, it's not, we should all secede. Instead, it's that when confronted by small men doing big and stupid things, we need to resist with all the creativity and wit we can muster. And if we can do so without losing the civility that makes life enjoyable, then so much the better. And that's sort of what I think. Yeah. I'm afraid I've decided that I actually am going to drink this beer as I answer questions. So rude as it is in front of you all, it's I don't know who left it here, but I'm very grateful for them.
Bill, thanks so much for coming here. Really pleasure to see you here tonight. I am about 80% of the way through Oil and Honey, and while I confess I haven't read the rest of your writing, apart from that article in Rolling Stone a couple years ago, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, I was very impressed and a little bit disappointed that you did stumble across in one section of this book the idea that the green movement or the anti-global warming movement is the conservative side of the climate question and not the other way around. And I was impressed by this, and I was just a little bit of a shame that it went by so quickly in the book, but I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I think what you're referring to is something that I've said a number of times, and which I really believe, which is that when we talk about climate change, indeed when we talk about a lot of things, but in this case, say climate change, there's nothing radical that we're talking about at all. I mean, people at 350 or whatever, what they're working for is a planet that works a tiny bit like the one we were born onto, where there's still some ice at either pole, the odd coral reef in between, you know, things like that. That's not a radical position at all. If you think about it for just a second, it's a deeply conservative position. Radicals work at oil companies. If you're willing to get up in the morning and make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and you're willing to do it once scientists have told you what will happen, and you're willing to keep doing it after the things that the scientists said were going to happen happened, then you're a radical on a scale that we have not encountered before on this planet. And our job is to figure out how to check that radicalism. And the checking can come in many ways. And I mean, I was thinking about this at one point in relation, one of the great victories of the last few years was when Shell a few years ago announced that it was going to drill in the Arctic. And in fact, President Obama gave them a permit to go up and drill. Think about that for a minute. Scientists had said if we warm the planet, the Arctic's going to melt. That would be bad. The Arctic melted. Shell didn't look at that and say, maybe we should go into the solar panel business. This isn't working out so well. They looked at that and said, oh, well, now that it's melted, it'd be easy to drill for more oil up there. We're getting to the point where, that's a fairly strong argument that the big brain was not a great adaptation, That's just, crazy. Happily, there were enough people with perfectly good-sized heads attached to very good hearts who went and got in the way. In Portland and Seattle harbors, they went out in small craft. We called them kayaktivists. And by the thousands, they blocked the giant 40-story drill rigs, kept them for days from moving out. Eventually, Shell managed to get them out, but the brand damage that they were suffering from these pictures day after day was enough that by the end of the summer, they tossed in the towel and said, we're going to not throw any more money after the $7 billion we already spent on this. We're going home. It was a great victory, and there have been many great victories in this fight, and there continue to be. But those people in the, out in the kayaks weren't radicals, it strikes me, in any meaningful sense of the word. They were just being good citizens. And I confess, I have it's funny having written a book about secession and having organized a lot of, huge protests and things. I have a very strong sort of sentimental, patriotic streak. I find it comes out a little bit when I'm in Philadelphia, and I think it stems from the fact that as a boy, I grew up in Lexington in Massachusetts. My summer job was giving tours of the Battle Green. I'd put on my tricorn hat and go out and tell the story of the beginning of the American Revolution. And really, if you think about it, the first battle on the planet against colonialism and imperialism and all those kind of things. And it left me as I say, a sentimental American in many ways. And it did me the favor of never having in my mind a confusion between dissent and lack of patriotism. You know, these guys were the original patriots. And so that's long reflections on a good short question. Thank you.
I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about Vermont's unique stance in the world between its two neighbor states. How did it get that way, and why does it continue to be that way? We have a place up there that we spend most of our summers, and we've always enjoyed its uniqueness. It seems like it's already seceded.
So let me begin by saying that Neshampany Creek is an excellent brewery, I must say. One of the reasons that I write about beer in this book is not just because Vermont is so great at it, although I'll get back to that in a minute. This sort of bears on the answer to your question. It's because beer was the first commodity where people really began kicking back against the homogenized, industrialized vision of things. Started in the 1970s in Britain with this thing called the Campaign for Real Ale, and it crossed the pond about 1980. At that time in 1980, they were down to about 25 breweries left in the country. Yingling's was one of the very few sort of surviving small breweries. But man, it took off. I wrote the first story for the Village Voice in 1984 about this micro-brewing phenomenon. I liked the taste. We traveled all around the country looking at all the like 10 or 11 of these things then. But what I really liked was this sense of localness, that suddenly people were, and now there are 3,800 or 4,200 or something breweries in America. Whenever I contemplate the fact that the planet is going to hell or someplace of a similar temperature, I am forced to remind myself that they're actually, on the other side of the ledger, way better things to put in one's mouth than there were when I was growing up, and that's definitely a good thing. Vermont was the center, along with a couple of other places, maybe in this country, maybe parts of the Pacific Northwest, but in Northern California, but Vermont was really the center of that resurgent localism, the local food movement, and many other things. And I think it's because communities, for many reasons, have stayed more intact there than elsewhere. Town meeting was one reason, but simply the fact that it's a collection of small villages. As I said, the most rural state in the Union. The biggest city in Vermont is 50,000 people, Burlington. Our capital, Montpelier, has 8,000 people. It's the only capital city in America without a McDonald's, something we hold dear. Because of that settlement pattern, and because of its rural nature, people have remained somewhat more in touch with their neighbors than is true elsewhere in America. Really, the last 50 years, the flowering of high consumer culture in our world has been a period when neighbors became an optional thing for Americans. If you had a credit card, you know, and I mean, by now you have a credit card, people will deliver all your groceries to your front door. You really never have to step outside, you know, and you never have to be in much contact with the people around you. 3/4 of Americans don't know their next door neighbor. They may know their name, but they have no relationship with them. That's a very new thing for human beings. I mean, we're socially evolved primates. We're testing out some new things in our society, and it's not working particularly well. People, Americans are, judging from the answers they give to surveys, significantly less happy with their lives than they were, say, in the late 1950s, despite the material progress in the years since. And I think the reason's pretty clear. The average American has half as many friends as they did 50 years ago. Okay? I mean, if you devote all your wealth, as we have, basically to the project of building bigger houses farther apart from each other, that's a natural corollary, you know. So when you're in a intensely rural place, neighbors are not quite as optional. You know, if you have bad roads, you inevitably end up driving into a snowbank or a ditch 2 or 3 times a year, and nobody in Vermont would ever think of driving by someone in a snowbank or ditch. You get out and everybody has chains in the car and you pull back. I mean, if you have a town of 400, you have to have a volunteer fire department. You have to have a fire department or you can't get insurance for your house, you know, so I mean, these sort of things happen, you know. And I think that the story of the next 50 years is neighbors are going to no longer be optional in that way. Even if we do everything right from this point in, for instance, on the fight around climate change, there's going to be way more of the kind of damage we've seen this past year between hurricanes and firestorms, whatever else. I was just out in Sonoma and Napa with our crew out there, and they were still shell-shocked from that fire that took out 7,000 homes, but everybody was rallying and trying to, you know, sort of bring things back as best they could, and so on. And people ask sometimes, where should I move to escape from climate change? In fact, they ask it often. You know, and in order of sort of descending plausibility, I mean, the answers I think are Mars, New Zealand, or realistically, someplace with a strong community. That's the best defense against trouble that there is. And, you know, we'll see. But I think that accounts for some of the difference. And, you know, communities eroded in Vermont as it has other places too, but it's still fairly strong. And you could sense that listening to Mr. Sanders and the set of concerns that he brought to the fore, which were basically about a stronger national community. And his slogan in the campaign, "Not me, us," was a very Vermont, you know, kind of idea. So New Hampshire to the east, its state motto is "live free or die," okay? Vermont's is freedom and unity. So, you know, what can I tell you?
Okay. I just have a question, just climate change in general. So if let's say you're campaigning for president, and you're talking to, you know, some coal miners in Kentucky or West Virginia, and, you know, it's been in their family all these years, and you know, mostly these are fairly, you know, depressed towns. How would you, like, if they asked about what's the future of the coal mines or of our industry, how would you respond? Sure. Or how would you deal with that?
It's a very good question. The first thing I wouldn't do is lie to people and tell them that it's all going to come back and going to be okay. It's actually a question that I think about a good deal. My mother's family is all from West Virginia and from coal country. That's where she grew up. So the transition away from fossil fuel and to renewable energy is necessary for climate reasons and inevitable for economic ones. The fossil fuel industry may be able to stave off that transition long enough to break the planet, but they're not going to stave it off for very long because free energy is a hard business proposition to beat in the long run, okay? And the sun and the wind are now by far the cheapest way to generate power, and getting cheaper with each passing week. That means that there are huge numbers of jobs necessary to make the transition to those things. And I mean, endlessly more jobs than there are in the fossil fuel industry. There's almost, one of the secrets of that whole debate is there's almost nobody left mining coal. There are more. Someone did a report a few weeks ago. You know, do you guys have here the Arby's roast beef sandwich chain? There's a sort of third-tier fast food chain across America. More people work at Arby's in America than mine coal in America, okay? Sort of rationally, the president should be convening roast beef summits in the Oval Office, talking about roast beef policy and whatever. But that doesn't mean that the people who live in those places don't have some well-founded nostalgia, if not for the job of mining coal, which is a crappy job, then at least for the good pay and stable benefits that allowed people to live a decent life. And so there has to be a serious effort at what people call just transition. Every bill that the Democrats have put forward for the last 15 or 20 years dealing with this has proposed fairly large sums of money exactly for that purpose. They've all been voted down by the Republicans, who are much more eager to hold those people as hostages, in their ongoing political fight. And it's a tremendous shame in many ways to watch it happen, because those are really interesting cultures and places with long, interesting traditions, including long, interesting union traditions, And it should be not at all difficult to figure out how to allow lots of those people to participate in this new economy. People at University of Michigan did a study demonstrating that the set of skills that people had as coal miners tracked extremely well to the ones we need for putting solar panels, for instance, on the roof of houses across America, that with a few weeks of retraining, you're capable of providing people with jobs that were much safer and that paid roughly the same wage. People might have to move, some of them, but that people were there because there was coal. If we can't use the coal anymore, and we can't, then people may have to move, some of them anyway. So nothing easy about it, but the worst thing to do is what we've done now, which is lie to people and insist that somehow magically this is all going to come back.
Bill, I'd just like to ask you to comment on the issue of motor vehicles and emissions that we all have to deal with. This area, the greater Delaware Valley, was rated this past summer as in the top 10 most polluted regions for air quality. Most people, at a younger age, don't realize that in the early 70s, when there was an oil embargo and this country initiated the right turn on red rule, it was to save gasoline, but the unintended consequence was that we were being subjected to far less pollution. And then at the same time, we've grown into a retail society where almost every business has a drive-through, and now we have cars with remote starters. And in this strip of the Mid-Atlantic, most of the states have a limit of 3 minutes to 4 minutes of motor vehicle idling, which almost nobody knows anything about. So I'm part of a local group. We're trying to get the police, we're trying to get the state to publicize this, and
so that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, in the slightly longer term, we're going to move. We have to move quickly to powering what cars we're going to use electronically with electric vehicles, and that's happening relatively fast in places around the world that are taking it seriously. Norway now sells more electric cars than internal combustion cars, and by 2025 you won't be able to buy a new gas car there. And Britain and France have set similar deadlines 5 and 10 years later, I think. So it's possible to imagine that coming. We're clearly moving into this era of autonomous vehicles, which will change things. If we're smart, we will use it as an opportunity to get away from the idea that everybody has to own their own car. And if we had deployed those things in fleets, you could get rid of 80% of vehicle traffic altogether. Think what a pleasant city Philadelphia would be with 80% less traffic, less number of cars in it, you know. While we're doing all this, extremely important to keep pushing hard on buses and bicycles, which are remarkably good. We talk a lot about electric cars and Teslas and things, and they're really cool. But the bicycle is one of the most beautiful pieces of technology on the planet, you know, with the sort of minimal application of muscle power. You can, I mean, if it hadn't been invented and someone just invented it tomorrow, be like, wow, that thing is really cool. You know, here we are. And so I think transportation is going to change, and I hope that it changes in more than just what the engine looks like going forward.
Hello, I'm halfway through the Globalization and Development Communication Master's Program at Temple University. And as an emerging communications professional and someone who's interested in pursuing a career in the environment sector, what advice would you give to someone who's about to start their career, especially in a time when credible information is sometimes treated as fake news?
It is such a good question. And I grew up a journalist, that's my background, and that was one part of it that I never worried about, never had occurred to me for till recently. When I came out of school, my first job was at the New Yorker and writing the talk of the town. And it just, everyone assumed that what you read in the New Yorker or the New York Times was someone's best effort at getting to the facts and saying what was correct and not. And that we now live in a world where that's no longer true, where everybody's just, its meaning is up for grabs, makes it very difficult. I'm glad you're doing it, however. And I think that one thing that's clear is we have new possibilities for making our own media in ways that we didn't before. I taught this for 5 or 6 years, ran this environmental journalism fellowship at Middlebury to train early career journalists in environmental journalism. It's possible we're going to start it again. If so, keep an eye out. What's impressed me is that of the 60 kids who went through it, 50 of them or so are making their way in the journalism business, doing great, great work. I mean, they keep winning book prizes and having great stories places and stuff. But they have to be much more talented than I ever was, because they have to be able to not just write, which I knew how to do, they have to be able to podcast and put up slideshows on the web and, on and on and on and on and on. It's a harder profession. And the margins for doing things, just try to find, if you can, places that allow you enough margin, enough time to do an interesting job about things. The internet's not conducive always to that. It wants things, lots of things quickly, and we've all been sort of conditioned to be sort of pinged at, and each new novel burst of whatever it is. We could all help you in a sense if we tried a little harder to be good readers, to read longer, more thoughtful pieces, to kind of support that kind of journalism. One of the good things that's happened in the last year is that post-Trump, I think people started to realize that a little bit, and a lot of people went and subscribed to the Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere. And so there's been a little recovery of some of that sort of center ground, but it's hard. You have both my condolences and my thanks for going at this.
I want to follow up on the discussion about the coal miners, but before doing that, I hope you'll indulge me in a little joke in terms of your fable. If Vermont were to secede, we'd lose 2 Democratic senators, but if we could get Texas to secede...
So the real thing here is, so Vermont actually probably will never secede because we're an old state and all you'd have to do is threaten to cut off Social Security and we'd capitulate. But I was just out in California, okay? There's 40 million people out there. It's got an economy the size of Germany's. They dominate all the industries that everyone wants to dominate now and going into the future. They have the same 2 senators as the 600,000 of us in Vermont. It makes no sense. The idea that we've worked out, that somehow the founding fathers worked out the perfect constitutional arrangement here in Philadelphia and that we would never, it was always going to work forever. We should be learning that lesson at this point. Any system, I said earlier to somebody, any system that spits out Donald Trump as the answer to the question, who should lead us, is not a system that's working effectively at the moment. So, go ahead, you asked a
Response than I expected. With respect to the coal miners, I was wondering what your observations would be if the solar and wind industries made an active attempt to recruit those coal miners and actually get them into different jobs.
So they have, to some degree, and it's been good to see. There are more people working in the solar industry in West Virginia than in the coal industry. There's people doing fabrication, and and this is without any government help. All the government help going exactly the other way. So they've made some. It's hard, obviously, because you don't need an endless number of solar installers in precisely the places where people are out in the, coal fields. And so, Americans have become significantly less mobile and no longer move as easily as they once did to follow opportunities and things. And I understand that. I am very place-bound myself, and it's hard to move, but that's part of what's going on there.
Hi, I was wondering how we can frame the discussion with our neighbors or deniers or skeptics or those that don't believe. I've heard them even subscribe to climate promoters as socialist, anti-capitalist. So if I like your idea that saving the planet is a conservative idea, but yet if our political conservatives are kind of against us because it would require change in the business model to move to a renewable energy or losing their oil or their, what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
So how would you help us bring that? Because I've also heard that political, or just having a discussion about climate change is like a political football or a hot potato in a family discussion or
Yep.
neighborly discussion. So how could you help us bring it all back
Sure.
together?
So, first thing to be said, by the way, is this is interesting and not what I would have expected. Socialist and things is no longer the epithet it once was. Among young people, people under the age of 35 in this country, there are more people who describe themselves as socialist than capitalist, which is very interesting, and I think a sign of what happens when you allow a system to become as unequal as the one that we have allowed ours to become. 30% of Americans are climate deniers. 70% understand more or less what's going on. They may not get how urgent it is, but they know that it's a problem and who's causing it and so on, which actually is a pretty good percentage. There's not that many things in America that we get to a 70-30 split. I mean, 54% of Americans believe Elvis is still alive. So, that's... most of that 30% are not persuadable in my experience, because they're not waiting for one more scientific study to kind of tip the balance in their mind. They don't have like some problem about infrared absorption in the upper atmosphere or whatever. It's ideological, and if you've spent the last 25 years marinating in Rush Limbaugh, it's extremely difficult to, make that kind of transition. That said, there are a couple of ways that people sometimes have some success. One, with people who have a military background. The fact that the Pentagon takes climate change very seriously. The admiral in charge of our Pacific forces, all our Pacific forces, last year said this is the single biggest problem that we face and the one we worry about the most, because of the migration and instability that it's causing and so on and so forth. Sometimes that persuades people. And sometimes for people who are serious Christians, the idea that this is an affront to the notion of loving one's neighbor, that it's extremely... I've actually had good luck. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher myself, but I sometimes with, even very hardcore evangelicals, often have been on mission trips to the developing world and things. And if you point out to them, just sort of reframe for them things that they saw, where they were, and help them to understand the challenges that people face as a result, or the amazing possibilities in the developing world coming as we have renewable energy technology and things, you can change their minds. The best way sometimes is to avoid the issue of climate change entirely and move to the issue of renewable energy. It turns out that almost everybody loves solar panels. Something like 85% of Republicans, Democrats, and independents all tell pollsters that they want more government support for solar panels. Their reasons differ. Democrats tend to be worried about environmental things. Republicans tend to like the idea that once they have a solar panel on their roof, they can cut themselves off from, they're self-reliant and, master of their own destiny. And I confess there's a big part of me that I really like watching the electric meter turn backward, on my, it's, everybody enjoys telling the utilities off. But I think in the end, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to convince them. The more important job is taking some percentage of that 70% and getting them actually engaged in this fight, doing something. That's why I'm glad people were passing around the clipboard, so that some people will join in the good efforts at 350 in Philadelphia and in Bucks County. I wouldn't ruin Christmas dinner. I eventually say to people, boy, I hope you're right. And if I really can't restrain myself at a certain point, I'll say, well, you may not believe in global warming, but global warming believes in you. So there we are.
Setting carbon aside, what do you do about the fact that you look at 90% of our fisheries are overfished, they're in collapse, they're fished to capacity. You've got, we're losing 13 million net acres a year to deforestation, habitat loss. We've got massive hypoxic dead zones around every part of the world wherever there's a water runoff. You've got 50 trillion pieces of tiny plastic that are all across the ocean. You've got water scarcity issues with 43 countries that are under severe stress. You've got mass extinctions going on right now, 1,000 times greater than the background. What do we do about all that?
Let's take somebody else's question. So one of the problems of climate change and the massive sort of existential threat that it presents is that it's caused us to triage a lot of other stuff along the way. Because you're right, there are a dozen other huge environmental problems. A lot of them are also tied to the use of fossil fuel and would be alleviated in part or in whole if we moved aggressively away from fossil fuel, at least in part, but not all of them. It's one of the reasons why I've kept trying to write, I mean, it's in this novel, but probably more systematically in books like Deep Economy, about the need to try and figure out much more sustainable economies, much more local economies, much more resilient economies than the ones we have at the moment. We're running a looting economy right now. I mean, as we sit here, the Senate is voting on a tax cut that's essentially looting the future. And explicitly, they're adding in things like drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to this tax bill, just because they can. These are the symptoms of what happens with a consumer economy of the scale and size that we've developed. And so there's no easy answer to those set of questions, but there is the answer of saying that we have to learn how to stop taking most of our satisfaction from stuff and start taking more of it from the things that we've left behind. Contact with the natural world, contact with each other. If there's a great metaphor or symbol for that, it's the building that we're in right now. The library, bless Mr. Franklin, is one of the greatest ideas that human beings ever came up with. One of the things that I love about being a writer is that my work from the minute I began was always available to everybody in the country for free. Because we'd set up, the books were the one thing that we decided we were going to make sure was available free to everyone. Now, the book economy is odd, and there's enough people still are good about buying books that people are able to keep writing them, make a living at them and write them and things. But the idea that we have this thing where we share them is really powerful. And I have no idea why it's only books that we decide that we can successfully share with each other. There are 1,000 other things that we could easily figure out how to share amongst ourselves. And if we did, we'd have not only the environmental benefits that went with that, but the concomitant pleasures of getting to mingle, getting to know each other, getting to be neighbors again. And on that note, I will stop and say thank you all very, very much.